Sometimes you do something you wish you could just take back. You can delete a text after sending it, clean a mess you made. Sometimes Control-Z is your best friend. But if you put it in the hands of enough people, there are just some things you can't take back. Out of all the Magic the Gathering product releases, Throne of Eldraine is the one that has the most wildly polarized reactions from players. Let's go back in time to 2019.
Throne of Eldraine for me was like a set that was just complete. It was easy to play. For me, I feel like it wasn't a set that had like too many things going on at the same time.
Throne of Eldraine scored too high on the innovation and power creep for me.
I think Thrones of Eldraine was a great time for Magic. I think it sparked a lot of the excitement about Magic.
Competitively, Throne of Eldraine was a mess. Once it was released, every competitive format was taken over by different cards of that specific set.
So kind of like Devin did, Magic, it was so scary.
This feels different than normal recording. I'm Toralf. No, I will start again. I would say people got surprised by how strong the whole set is. There was a major shift.
There are many Magic the Gathering cards. They've been printing Deckmaster on the back of Magic cards for as long as Ariana Grande has been breathing, and when building a deck, you have to choose between 30,000 different game pieces. So why are people still buying cards? There's already 30,000 of them. Well, Magic is more like a rule set you can use to build whatever you can imagine than a self-contained game. The company that makes the cards invents many of these rule sets themselves. They call them formats, and the community came up with an endless amount of their own formats as well. But never doubt the lack of sanity of the Magic community, because there's also a community format where you and your opponent share a deck of the least pleasant blue cards you can find and only win by slapping each other in the face with 10 shared fish cards that faint if you don't control an island. And it's wonderful. Magic cards have different power levels and are used in different formats. A card that is excellent when you play with 40 cards you opened in some booster packs an hour ago won't necessarily win you a big orange trophy in a format where you have to choose between 75 from all the best Magic cards ever printed. But there was a time in Magic where formats didn't exist yet. Magic was just cracking packs and sometimes dumpstering your friend with a Sarah Angel. And Magic at that moment had a big problem. See, Richard Garfield, the creator of the game, knew that he was making cards with a big power imbalance. But he also knew that it made the game exciting, and when asked about it, he'd answer that the imbalance only really becomes a problem if the game is massively popular and people can acquire more and more of the powerful cards. And then if you ever get there, your game is way more popular than you expected. That's a good problem to have. Now, there are two things I know to be true about the year 1993. The first of them is that Magic the Gathering was a whopping success. And the second is that the power level of the cards at the time was, and I'm sorry to be using the technical term here, but the power level was bananas. So when they got to that problem, the solution they found was to create formats. They made two, and they spent much longer thinking about their design than their titles because they use the same naming conventions toddlers use when naming their hamsters. Type 1 is where you could play anything outside of a small ban list. And Type 2 is a format you can still play to this day on Arena, except it's called Standard and makes cool noises when you play your Sarah Angel. But Type 2 revolved around playing only cards from the last 2 years. And every year, the cards from 2 years ago would just rotate out, encouraging players to play with new cards. Magic is saved. Now you don't need to print a card that competes with Black Lotus, because Black Lotus is for those money bags playing Type 1 who lose the value of a card if they sneeze while organizing their collection. Wizards of the Coast is even going to experiment with lowering the power level of the entire game because it's okay. Most of your player base plays a format that phases out every 2 years until they don't. And I'm here to tell you about how the designers of the game had to break the safety glass and press the big scary red button that made all the Magic cards stronger a few years ago, and why they had to do it. I need to talk about something scary. A necessary evil that you need to survive, but the more you have of it, the more it hurts you. Like coffee. Now I know it's a touchy subject, so I'd like to make my favorite parallel to power creep, and I promise I'll only take a moment of your time and then we'll go back to talking about thick pieces of paper with dragons on them, but please indulge me for 1 second as I tell you about how oxygen is in fact bad for you. A long time ago, everything on Earth would just swim or float around whimsically and they didn't leave the water. And Earth was a neat place, except if you dialed back your time machine to 3 billion years ago, it would be your last time trip because you would instantly die from lack of oxygen, and also they didn't have any coffee. Savages. But then photosynthesizers evolved and started creating oxygen, which is honestly kind of a big red flag on their part because it killed almost everything on Earth and created what is called the Great Oxygenation Event. It unalived almost everything that was alive on the planet, and the only tough poison-resistant survivors eventually started the evolution chain that would lead to the world's most annoying species, us. But then we made up for it by creating Magic the Gathering. Still, oxygen is so corrosive and dangerous that it leads to stuff like us aging, metal rusting, and the main reason that if aliens ever fly by Earth, they'll go like, ooh. Hell no. Anyways, one of the great ironies of life to me is that the same thing that is allowing us to breathe and brought us huge hits like dinosaurs and Eurovision is also slowly killing us.
The word power creep in games usually refers to game pieces becoming stronger as a means to keep enjoyment or engagement with the game high. There's very little reason for me to buy new game pieces, but if they're more powerful, then there's a certain need created for them.
If you have any expanding entertainment product, there is a natural tendency toward power creep. If you look at any number of comics, books, films, you will often find power creep, the stakes being raised, the hero's journey, taking them through bigger and bigger challenges. It's quite natural.
It's like movies, right? There's a bigger explosion, there's a better plot twist. One easy and sometimes even lazy way is to make cards better, because then people go like, I have to buy that card. It goes into my commander deck. If it's done right, which it can, it's healthy. If it's wrong, it destroys the game. Like, there are many games who died to power creep.
And the people that design the game of Magic are smart people. They're mostly passionate gamers like us, and they didn't need to watch Spider-Man to know that with great power comes great responsibility. So they slapped on their protective goggles and have been slowly cranking up the power dial over the years with extreme caution. You can see this in the history of the cards. In 1993, they printed a 4-mana 5/5 called Juzam Jin, and it had the downside of costing you 1 life per turn. And it was cracked. It was so powerful that a few years later, they printed a 4-mana 5/5 that had to be put on top of your library. At the end of each combat, it did something. And it would have to sit there and think about what it had done to deserve it. But 7 years later, they printed a 4-mana 5/5 that would disappear after 3 turns, and Blastoderm was a staple of the game at the time. And 12 years later, at 4 mana, you'd get the same stat line, but it would have an upside when it was in your graveyard. Now, in 2019, in a set that won't be named, they printed a 4-mana 4/4. That, you might want to pour yourself a cup of tea for this, has Vigilance, Death Touch, and Haste, can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, combat damage that would be dealt by creatures you control can't be prevented, and whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it also deals that much damage to target planeswalker that player controls. But power creep like this is the reason players have been playing the game for so long. People keep coming back when they see exciting new cards and they don't get bored with playing against Blastoderm for 20 years. But in the same way oxygen causes your cells to slowly die despite you needing it to survive, the game designers realized they should probably be lowering the dosage. Leading up to Battle for Zendikar in the mid-2010s, Wizards of the Coast, realizing that most people play a format that is only played in slices of 2 years at a time, decided that it was time to stem the bleeding and reduce the power level to a slow drip to aid in the longevity of the game. I'm gonna give myself the right to name this period because I couldn't find anyone else online who had done so already, and in the name of Battle for Zendikar, I'm gonna call it the Zendikar Wastes. Starting with Battle for Zendikar, research and development made a conscious effort to power down their marquee sets. This does mean that Standard would be generally weaker, but along with that small nerf would come the ability to open up the design space to higher cost cards, and some effects that are not typically impactful enough for competitive play. I think a good example that illustrates this is that Reflector Mage became such a stone cold staple in Standard that it eventually had to get banned. And it's just a 3-mana 2/3 that bounces a creature and doesn't allow you to cast it for a turn. If you play that in today's Standard, your opponent would probably call up Arena customer service because it has to be a bug. No one would willingly spend 3 mana to do that. But an unexpected consequence of powering everything down is that if you did make a mistake, it became extremely costly. Like how Gideon, ally of Zendikar, ran rampant around competitive tables because they didn't mean to make it that strong, and it's okay, mistakes happen. Except if you made all the other cards around it weaker, it sticks out like a broccoli in a fruit bowl. WotC always tries to push types of cards that embody the feeling of a set to higher power levels to leave a lasting memory on the players. This is generally a good thing. Many of our fondest memories are about how a world visited by the game made you feel, and that is most conveyed by card design. The problem is that when you make everything less powerful, it's like you're cooking with jet engines instead of a barbecue. There's only a really thin margin between edible and burnt. You want to make cool artifacts that embody the relatable act of driving, but then Smuggler's Copter goes vroom 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 on your opponent's life total. Emrakul is the chase card in your set, and you want to make her unique and exciting, but if the rest of your top end can't beat it, it becomes a big spaghetti-shaped problem you have to face over and over again. But the bigger issue at hand is that every dance move that WotC was making was to a beat that the players were no longer listening to. Because slowly but surely, like plants move towards the sunlight, the Magic player base started moving away from Standard and towards a less competitive, more creative and social way to play. Because in the end, if only one thing is true, is that everything will eventually become Commander. And I've already said this 8 minutes ago, but Commander is a format where you play 100 card decks against 3 other people. Every card you play is only in your pile once and tends to theme around one card that you always get to play at any point in the game. But most importantly, you can play cards that are older than 2 years old, which meant that people that played Standard had a completely different feeling about the new cards that were released than the players that didn't. Seeing a considerable dip in excitement for new product releases, Wizards of the Coast realized it was time to dust off the forbidden button. If they were going to meet the expectations of the ever-growing Commander and Modern community, they would have to give a one-time power-up booster shot to the entirety of the following set releases for it to catch up with the power level of the Eternal formats. And all this has been a long-winded introduction because we finally got to the part of the story where they, and we'll all say it together, where they released Throne of Eldraine. Throne of Eldraine, like most Magic sets, was in design and development for a long time. They were planning on making an Arthurian court set. You know, a king who finds a lake sword, befriends a Gandalf-like wizard, his table is round, and he goes on knight adventures with his knight friends. The thing is, Magic the Gathering is already pretty Arthurian already, and it just felt like a regular Magic the Gathering set. Magic already has wizards and lake swords and Gandalf-like figures and knight friends, so they decided to add a bunch of Central European fairy tale elements to Eldraine, and that's really what made the world memorable to most people. Now, this set was supposed to be the first one in a year where they would sneak in a one-time glow up to the strength of the average Magic the Gathering card. The goal was to shift everything's power level once, and then steadily, slowly increase the power creep afterwards to make up for the Zendikar wastes period. In and out in the amount of time it takes to say Asmorano Madikadice in a Kuldakar. What could go wrong? Competitive Magic caught fire. They did get what they wanted. Eldraine definitely had the dance moves to tango with the older formats. A boogeyman with 8-pack abs ran across Standard, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, getting banned everywhere he laid his little fairy feet. The final game action on the 2019's Eternal Weekend Vintage Championship was the tournament's winner attacking with an Alpha Black Lotus, and a €100,000 card was turned into an Elk by Oko to attack the opponent. 70% of the players in Mythic Championship 6 were playing an Oko food deck. And for those of you who weren't around during the 8 minutes Oko was legal for, it's a 3-mana planeswalker that does everything. He makes artifacts that gain you life. He makes your worst cards into 3/3 beaters and then makes your opponent's best creatures into tiny 3/3s. And then he can even steal your opponent's cards. All that with enough loyalty that attacking it down is some kind of futile Sisyphusian joke. This set was also the one with the adventure mechanic, which was probably developed by Exhibit because it all revolved around putting good spells on your good spells. And adventures was so cheaply costed that you could cast the second part of the card 0 to 2 turns after the first one. And how? Adventures is supposed to take a really long time. You don't go on adventures to the bathroom. Oh, well, sometimes. Needless to say, competitive Magic players were quite upset about the state of the game. In 2019, Brian Hawley from the design team admitted that some of the cards were simple mistakes that passed through their playtesters, but that the power level for Eldraine is generally what they aimed for. And I'm gonna pause the video for a second for you to think about that. And you know what? I generally see it. Eldraine was powerful, sure, but that's what made it exciting. And I can already hear the fingers of some keyboard cannoneers out there saying, ooh, what's he knew what they were doing with the cards. But let me remind you that even competitive Magic players didn't realize that Oko was good until it was released. Let's play a fun game. I'll read the top comment of spoiler pages of some Eldraine cards that have now been banned. On Embercleave, Sebastian Franz said, I don't know exactly, I guess it's a win more? And then Goose said, cool, but not great. About Once Upon a Time, Wick2 said, I mean, the concept is very cool and it'll see some use, but very far from a 4-time in every deck that runs green. And then Crypthim said, the card is playable in green standard beatdown decks. About Oko, Blacklist7 said, somewhat weak for modern or standard, but for EDH it's broken. About Escape to the Wilds, Jeff Pratt said, I'm having a hard time figuring out what deck would want this. Gruel Aggro? And my point is not to make fun of these people, it's to illustrate how we are all these people. It's really hard to evaluate cards without playing with them a lot.
It's really hard to tell if you're not playing competitive, because sometimes cards look really good when you see them, and then you play them, and then I feel like, maybe it wasn't as good, but it looked so good.
Balancing games is quite difficult because you have a small number of game developers who are trying their best not to break their game, whereas you have a huge number of players out there that will absolutely do their best to break it. So game developers always have to walk this very fine line of making the new stuff just powerful enough, and it's almost impossible to nail it. Also because different parts of your audience have different needs.
So I was very interested in this set because I recently won a tournament and I had to play with the cards in future tournaments because you got invited, and I said Oko is not a good card. I remember, because what you gotta do, you make a food, you make 3/3s, yeah, whatever. It's and I remember arguing with a friend who was making a very clear point that this is basically the best thing ever printed, which I made fun of, and I was wrong, so.
And while researching the slice of history for this video that I had remembered as a competitive scene hosting a funeral for Magic the Gathering, I realized that the comments and blogs and general discourse about this was a lot more positive than I had remembered. Not only is Eldraine and Theros Beyond Death associated with a boost in card sales, but when peeking back in time, the story I've been hearing on repeat is how exciting the new cards were and how they brought new passionate players into the game in the first place. For once, new products were affecting Modern and Commander, and playgroups began booming. People were calling their friends and saying, "Hey babe, wake up, Magic got good again." I've been speaking to countless players that remember Theros and Throne of Eldraine with the kind of nostalgia that reminds me why I'm playing Magic to begin with. Every card was so new and exciting, and you wanted to try to figure it out and build a deck with it, but you also couldn't wait to get to the next card because the possibilities seemed endless. And extra power and complexity boost to the game meant that the designers could really cook with it and add flavor to the cards in a way we hadn't seen for a while.
For me, it was the kind of the essence of Magic, which is probably weird because it has like all this history before it. Eldraine condensed what I loved about Magic before, which was this combination of silliness, also kind of just like cool fantasy stuff. So,
but still, competitive players and content creators still seem to look back at this time as a big mistake. And that's because there actually was one big mistake. But it's not what people think it is. It's a faux pas that Wizards of the Coast did at the same time they pressed the power up button. The oopsie was making an announcement for a new design that went down in the history of Magic as a bit of a curse word. Because in 2019, parallel to the power boost, WotC announced Fire Design. Mark Rosewater, the lead designer for Magic, has a fun acronym or title for about every design principle they launch. And I assume it's because his team members remember it better that way. People love acronyms. That's why we don't call him as soon as possible Rocky. ABBA is just much more memorable than Agneta, Bjorn, Benny, and Anifrid. From 2008 on, Magic design had taken a new philosophy that Mark Rosewater had called the New World Order, which is a pretty extravagant way to say make cards less complex. The goal was that commons would have very little text, uncommons just a little bit more, and that rares would have more but still have one general goal to the card. This was to help new players get into the game and combat complexity creep. That time had now ended, and starting with Eldraine, Mark Rosewater had suggested a new design philosophy called Fire.
Fire design is a term coined by Mark Rosewater sometime around like 2016, 17. And it's an acronym, and it stands for fun, interactive, repeatable, and engaging.
It's actually, so I don't know what people were guessing in the chat. I have no idea what it stands for.
Can I make my guess?
Yeah.
What if it's F it, reprint everything?
Aaron Forsyth, I hope you got that.
That is absolutely what it stands for. Man,
that's canon now.
That is too, like if it didn't stand for that, it certainly does now.
Right. What does it actually stand for? Can you tell us?
Fun,
Yeah.
inviting,
Yeah.
replayable, and exciting.
Fire design is basically a rapid gun shooting at you with cards. You look at the card, I love it. You get shot at the next card, I love it. You get shot at the next card, I love it. And this is the idea of you loving all the cards.
But something is amiss. Let's read those keywords again.
Fun, inviting, replayable, and exciting.
None of those are synonyms for powerful. Mark Rosewater often brings up that he's a little bit annoyed that people saw Once Upon a Time in Oko and associated that with fire design, when in reality, fire design was about adding a little bit more complexity and not power to the cards.
Prevalent sentiment among tournament players at the time was, oh yeah, fire. It is literally on fire. It was a time where people either panicked or resigned to a sort of gallows humor.
It was kind of a worrisome thought for many that now every year we would receive new cards that are much better than the old ones and then subsequently banned basically immediately. But it was just bans after bans, and then a new set came out with more cards that needed bans. It felt like the sky was falling on competitive Magic, that is.
You'll often hear old school players complain that new cards all have 4 lines of text and an enters the battlefield ability, and they're right. And that is by design. R&D realized that we have a lot more fun when we always have decisions to make and we feel like we can claw our way back into a losing game. People with less gray hairs than I do might not remember this, but there was a time in Magic where creatures were simpler, yes, but most games would devolve into both players running out of resources and relying on the top of their library, because that coin flip would tell you whether you're in the game or not. And that was not fun. Ripping a land off the top of your library when you had no other cards in hand was a 1-star Magic experience. Click the arena button. I did not have fun this game. Permanents with many abilities let you keep doing things even when your hand is empty. And cards that draw cards or surveil, scry, or search your library for something are key ways to keep your draws exciting. It's just unfortunate timing that their announcement that they would try to make the cards more fun coincided with them trying to make the cards more eternally playable. Honestly, if you had asked me 6 years ago, I would have told you that Wizards of the Coast tripped on their shoelaces in 2019 card design. But now, with much more information, and I like to think the wisdom brought by many years to consider it, Magic shedding its old winter fur, forgoing its old ways, and acknowledging that it was out of date seems like such a tough decision for the design team to make, and in the end, I thank them for it, because the fires of Eldraine are what forged Magic into what it is today and truly made it better. No matter how you feel about power creep or commander, the year 2019 will always be a cornerstone of Magic the Gathering and a memorable one.
It's much more dangerous to have somebody look at the set and say like, I don't have any of the cards I like, then people go like, I don't know which cards to choose, but I want to start play tomorrow because all of them are excited. If you have to risk some tournament integrity to keep Magic alive, go for it. You know, like, the tournament players will deal with them. If your game dies, but your tournament players are happy, you also lost.
And in the end, if there's one thing I'll always be truly forever grateful for, is that I get more people to shuffle up and play a game of Magic with, even if they turn my creature into a Fibble Flipping Elk. In and out in the amount of time it takes to say Asmorano Mardika. In and out in the amount of time it takes to say Asmorano Mardika Diced in a Kuldakar. Asmorano Mardika Asmorando Mardika Diced in a Kuldakar. What could go wrong?